Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We're just going to have a pause while people log in. So we're just going to play you a short video. Okay, thank you for that. Here is your agenda for today. If you could please use the Q&A for questions and the chat function for any chat messaging you want to do. Otherwise, I will now pass over to your chair, David Foad.
Right, good morning. I'm David Foad, editor of Public Sector Catering magazine, and thank you for joining us for our webinar today on the 20% Less But Better Meat campaign. We have with us today a great panel lined up to give you their take on this campaign and to answer any questions you might have. We have Andy Jones, chair of the PSC 100 group. He's been involved in hospital catering for more than 30 years and previously served as a chair of the Hospital Caterers Association. He currently has a consultant role with NHS Facilities, advising on patient and retail catering in Birmingham. In 2016, he took on the role of chair of the PSC 100 group, which works to share information and ideas across the different parts of the sector. Good morning, Andy.
Good morning, David. How are you?
Yeah, fine, thank you. Yeah. Next, we have Professor Angela Tregear from the University of Edinburgh Business School, who has been coordinating an EU-funded project called Strength to Food that has looked at sustainability of school meals across Europe and come up with some very interesting findings. Good morning, Angela.
Hello there, David. Good morning, everyone.
And we also have Adam Wilkinson, who has worked with many local authorities in the UK, developing ways to measure the value and community benefit of public procurement. He's been involved in creating a carbon calculator tool based on the data that has come out of the Strength to Food project. Good morning, Adam.
Good morning.
We have Simon Billing, Chief Executive of the Eating Better Alliance, an umbrella group representing more than 60 organisations working towards a goal of reducing meat and dairy consumption by 50% by 2030. And he'll be looking at the benefits of reducing meat consumption. Good morning, Simon.
Good morning, David. Good morning, everyone.
And finally, we're lucky to be joined by Stuart Roberts, Deputy President of the National Farmers Union, who will be telling us about the benefits for all of eating ruminant meat and supporting UK farmers. Good morning, Stuart.
Morning, David.
That's great. Just before we turn to our panel, I'd like to remind everyone of how the webinar is going to work. Other than the panelists and me, everyone else will be muted. If you want to get in touch with the webinar, you've got a choice. You can put a question to the panelists using the Q&A function, making sure to include your name and company. And please keep this to questions rather than comments and statements, so we can get through as many questions as possible. The other way to get in touch is to share a comment, and for that we ask you to use the chat function. But remember to choose the option to all panelists and attendees so we can all see it. We won't unfortunately be able to answer any questions that come through to us on the chat function. Right, let's move straight on now to our panel. Starting with you, Andy, please.
Thank you, David. Good morning, everybody. Hope you're all well and you're all keeping safe at this time. Thank you all for joining us. I just want to lay out where the 20% less meat campaign started. It started last year with the PSMEI Top 20 luncheon, and we had all the chairs of all the associations as well as the other people who at that time in the top 20 last year, and also suppliers there. And I want to really thank them for their support. They made this happen. So the campaign was literally, it's about public sector because are being encouraged to sign up to the campaign aimed at looking at less meat on the menus, but using the money that we save for better quality meat. And this was driven by our customer base, requiring that, asking us to move to a more healthier diet. So we've got the healthy diet, the sustainability, and obviously the carbon also from it. So we were looking at the world environment, the health and well-being, the footprint, and meeting our customer demands. And I think it really has gone really well. The campaign has gone well. We've been able to engage with different groups to get the messages over. And I agree, we're never going to agree fully with everybody because this is a very, very complex issue and issue going forward, which I'm hoping today we will get some more light on. But really, that was the phase one of the campaign. The aim was not to demonise meat. It was never about demonising meat. It was about, as I say, part of healthy diet for people and reducing that. Sorry, I've just had a message pop up on my screen. That's put me off. So the method was asking people to reduce by 20%. I've actually done it where I've worked currently. We've taken 20% off, but we've increased the quality of meat. We've put more sustainable fish on the menus, and the feedback has been tremendous. So we've been able to put really great quality. We've now got roasts on twice a week. So where we have saved it, we've really made that. But I think what we've got to do now is look where we move to. And this webinar is going to help us move, I believe, to what I'm calling, as the chair of the PSC 100, phase two. And that's looking at really evidencing what we've done. I think it's about evidence. And there's a lot of data out there. And people can chop and change data as the one. But we now need in the public sector to evidence it ourselves. So it's really looking at our carbon footprint, our sustainable targets, which yesterday our Prime Minister laid out the green plan, and there will be more to come to that. And it was when we set the meat 20% target, it was really good to know that Parliament, where we actually were when we set it, they listened to us, because only days later, that was a target set on the sustainable target for the UK on 20%. So we were actually at the forefront. We were the leaders. We influenced that. So, and the other one is waste, because waste is all about, if we don't control our waste, we won't have the impact that we really want to see on our carbon, and obviously that will impact on our sustainable targets. So really, David, it's to thank everybody where we are, and I really want to set this tone to stay. We're now moving to phase two, and the campaign was launched in April in the midst of all the pandemic, and people have really, as they have, the caterers have been absolutely superb up and down the UK on responding in difficult times to achieve our first objective. So now it's on to phase two. So that's really, David, where I'd like to just say thank you to everybody, and back to the panel.
Okay, thanks, Andy. Now I'd like to turn to Professor Angela Tregear. Angela.
Hello there, David, and hello and good morning, everyone. I've got a PowerPoint presentation, so I'll just start sharing my screen now, and you can let me know if it's working. Okay, so can you see that now?
Yes, we can, Angela.
Yes, we can.
Brilliant. Okay, so good morning, everyone. So in my presentation, I'd like to share with you some of the key results from our Strengths of Food research project, which studied the sustainability of public catering services. Now, the starting point for our research was a bit different from the current campaign, but we have actually ended up aligning with much of the principles of the campaign. So let me talk you through these results and show you where we've got to. So what was it that we were aiming to find out with this research? Well, people participating in the webinar today will know more than most that catering providers have always adapted and adjusted in light of changing customer demands and changing policy signals. And in recent years, that has included shifting away from primarily low-cost oriented procurement models to the sourcing of more local and organic food. But there's been surprisingly little dedicated research on what the sustainability impacts are of these different procurement models. And so it was this gap that our research sought to address. And so what we did was undertake in-depth case studies of 10 primary school meal services in 5 European countries. And we investigated many aspects of the sustainability impacts of those cases, as you can see on the questions listed there. Now, this morning, I'm just going to share with you the results relating to the carbon footprint of these 10 cases and their local economic impact, but I will make some reference to some of our other findings along the way. Now, the cases themselves, their locations are shown on the map here. So you can see that in 4 of the 5 countries, we chose a low-cost oriented meal service model and a meal service that sourced a proportion of local food. In Italy, the 2 cases were an organic source case and a local organic source case. The pictures show you some typical dishes on the daily menus in the other 4 countries. And it was very notable. There was a complete absence of burgers, chips, nuggets, or foods of that sort. And also there was only ever 1 single daily option available to be taken, which is quite interesting from a UK perspective. So let me tell you about the carbon footprints of these 10 cases. And we started by finding out which foods the 10 case meal services procured. And the results are shown on the chart here. So along the bottom, we have the 5 countries and the 10 cases. And the colour coding in the chart here shows you which foods were purchased and in what proportion. So you'll see, for example, in the middle here, the Italian cases, they procured the most food per average meal. And a very large proportion of those meals were comprised of fresh fruit and vegetables, so that's the dark green, and very small amounts of meat. In contrast, you can see that in the Greek and the Serbian cases, the dark red segment here, quite a large proportion of their average meals was comprised of fresh meat, and within that, quite a large proportion of beef. It's quite interesting to look at the UK cases because those average meals contain the lowest amounts of fresh fruit and vegetables and the highest amounts of processed fruit and vegetables. So how do these food procurements translate into carbon emissions? Well, that's shown on the next chart. And so what we have again is the 5 countries and the 10 cases. In this chart, there's a pair of bars for each case. The left-hand bar shows the food weights and proportions exactly as in the previous slide. And the right-hand bar in the pair shows the corresponding carbon emissions. Now, immediately the eye is drawn is it not, to the Greek cases, because they have by far and away the highest emissions of all the cases. And there's two main reasons for this. I should also mention that the carbon emission bars have two extra colours on them. The dark blue shows the transport related emissions, and the dark grey show the emissions associated with the disposal of the food waste. So coming back to the Greek cases then, the first main contributory factor to their high emissions is the food waste disposal. And that's because 100% of the food waste from these cases went to landfill, whereas in all the other countries, the waste was disposed entirely or mostly in digester or composting facilities, which have a very low carbon burden. The other main contributory factor to the Greek emissions is the high proportion of fresh meat in the menu, and particularly the high proportion of beef. And we can see the same effect in the Serbian cases. By contrast, the Italian cases, although they were procuring the most food per average meal, their emissions are low, and that's because of the high proportion of fresh fruit and vegetables in the menus and the small amounts of meat. Interestingly, our nutritional analysis of the menus found that the Italian menus were performed most strongly in terms of meeting nutritional standards. So there is a good alignment there between the low carbon feature of these menus and also the nutritional quality and nutritional balance. However, in the Italian menus, our plate waste research found that there was high levels of plate waste. So there is still some work to be done there to take these wonderfully healthy and low carbon menus and make them attractive and appealing to the children themselves. Moving on then to tell you about the local economic impact of these case meal services. And there we were wanting to find out how much of the meals budget stayed in the local areas. And we did this by finding out what the meal budgets were spent on. So how much was spent on the catering staff, how much was spent on suppliers, and whether those staff and suppliers lived in the local area or not. We then estimated how those staff and suppliers re-spent that money, and again, whether that was in the local area or not. By doing this, we were able to calculate the added value generated for the local economy, expressed as a ratio called a local economic multiplier. So this chart here shows how the meals services spent their budgets and the proportion that was local and non-local. So across the 10 cases, the colour coding here is such that the dark colours show the proportion of local spending, and the light colours is the proportion of the budget that was spent outside the area. So for example, you can see that in the Serbian local case, the vast majority of the total meals budget was spent on local staff and suppliers, whereas in the Greek low case, you can see that only a very small proportion was spent on local staff and suppliers. So how does that translate into economic value generated for the area? Well, in this chart, we've got exactly the same patterns of spending shown, but floating above each bar, there is a number, and this number is the local economic multiplier ratio, and it's a number between 1, which indicates a very small amount of added value, and 3, which indicates a high amount of added value for the local economy. So we find that, coming back to our Serbia local case, it has a ratio of 2.46. What that means in practical terms is that for every €1 or equivalent currency unit spent from this meals budget, an additional 1.46 euros is generated in value for the local economy. In contrast, our Greek low case example here with very small amounts of spending, its ratio of 1.59. For every €1 spent from this meal budget, only an additional 59 cents is generated for the local area. One last thing to point to you bring to your attention, something quite interesting going on with the UK cases. You'll see that the UK low case spent much more on local staff, that's the dark green bit, than the UK low case, but their multiplier ratios are almost identical. And the reason for that is that the UK low case spent much more of its budget on its catering staff, all of whom lived in the local area. And this is quite an important result because normally when we talk about local economic impact, our focus of attention is on suppliers, right? It's on supporting farmers, supporting food processors, etc. What this result indicates and emphasises is that the proportion of the meals budget spent on staff, on catering staff, because they typically live in the local area, also makes an important contribution to the local economy. And that's often overlooked. So wrapping up what we're doing now with the research, well, we're developing a strategic guide for catering professionals, and David, Andrew and team are helping us put that together. It'll be available soon. And we're taking the data and the calculation formula from the research to develop a meal analyzer tool that will allow catering professionals and providers to calculate their own carbon emissions and local economic impact so that they can benchmark and make improvements. And that's what Adam is going to go on and talk about in his presentation. That's all from me for now though, and I'll hand you back to David now.
Thank you very much, Angela. And as she so rightly said, we've got Adam up next, who's going to tell us a little bit more about the development of this tool. Adam?
Hi, yes, thank you very much for that. I think I may be able to, Andrew's going to do my screen sharing for me as I've had a few technical difficulties. So I want to really go directly on from what Angela was talking about. And David, if you could, or Andrew, if you could move on to the next slide. And thank you. Really where we started from, and I should say that we've also a partner in the same project as Angela has, and we've done the economic impact, but we're also responsible for the development of some tools. So this is an example of that part of our work. And our intention here is very much to say, what can we do that takes the research and turns it into something which is of practical value for procurers? And what in fact we were trying to do is to say, if caterers are being called upon to reduce their catering, to reduce their costs, to improve their carbon output, to improve public value, then how could we use this data to help them with that? We very much concentrated in this on asking for information in the simplest possible way from caterers and in a form that they're already likely to have. And then so that we can use that to give them really good, and Andrew, if you click again, really good information on what the impact of that carbon is. So if we could move on to the next slide. And again, I'm going to go quickly through that information, the information we ask for from caterers, and then we'll have a look at the results. So you'll see on this first section that what we're really interested in here is the, if you like, normal food categories, the same sort of categories Angela used in her research. And all we ask for is 1 week of that food purchase by weight and organised by percentage. So we can see in this example, we're looking at 16% red meat and let's say 8% dairy. And the user can just work with that until they're happy that they've got those percentages right and that the figure at the bottom is 100. Then we ask for just 3 other additional pieces of information. One is what the average weight of meal is in grams. Another is the number of meals per week. And the last is the number of weeks per year the service is run for. Most school catering runs at 38 weeks a year, as I'm sure you know, but we can go up to 52. So if you're doing an all-year service, that's no problem. And if we move on to the next slide, we then have to ask a few pieces of information about the environment, of which the first is what proportion of the food you serve actually gets lost as plate waste. This is probably the most difficult question, I suspect, for caterers to answer, as it's not something that's regularly recorded. And we will use a system kind of default value if nothing's entered here. But we would urge you to do your best to estimate it, as it does have quite a large impact. And lastly, on the environmental side of things, whether the waste is disposed of in a digester or in landfill. Finally, we just asked for some outline financial information to enable us to have a look at what the local economic impact might be of the service. At the moment, in this version of the tool, we're just simply asking for a sort of local area radius. And we would say that's where mostly we would expect that's where you consider your local suppliers to come from, but it's up to you what that definition of local is really. And we want to know what your total budget is for the provision of the food service for both staff and suppliers. And then just briefly again, how that's split down by percentage between local and non-local suppliers and staff. Once you get that all right and it adds up to 100, the bar at the bottom will go green as it is now. And if we move on again, you immediately come to the results screen. This is probably the most important screen of the whole tool really. We wanted to try and make it as accessible as possible. We wanted to make it immediate and we wanted to make it meaningful as well. So what we've done is to organize the various categories of food down the left-hand side, and you'll see it as in Angela's work, we've now added both disposal method and transport to that. And then to the left-hand side of the broad black bar, we have the food in kilograms now worked out as an annual weight. And against that, we have the consequent carbon emissions that are created as a result of that. And you can see very obviously that which was the intention really, that different weights of food generate very different amounts of carbon output. And quite obviously red meat at the top is by far the largest contributor in that format. But it's worth saying also, if you look down to transport, in the early days of this kind of world, there was a lot of talk about food miles and local and transport is clearly a significant factor, but it's not the only factor. And so it's useful to see that as a glance as to where your carbon is coming from. The second thing we do on the slide is to give you some totals at the bottom of the slide. And we also try and pull out the key points of information coming from the data that we've got and how that is synthesized with the data from the research. So in this case, red meat is only 16% of your food weight, but is 44.4% of the total emissions. And then finally, as a standard point, there's another link at the bottom of the screen, and that will take you through to a complete explanation of how all this data is compiled, and it makes the whole system completely transparent. And it is worth saying that is very much our intention. This is not a tool with an agenda. This is simply trying to take the best data we can get and turn it into a form that's as useful to you as possible. How you choose to use that data is up to you. And if we can move on to the next slide. The second element that we look at in detail is the impact of your plate waste. And we can look at this now in two different ways, really. One is what the financial cost of that might be. And in this case, we're looking at £88,000 of thrown away food every year, which is not insignificant in terms of public value. And also what the embodied carbon of that plate waste is as well. Again, it's a tricky point to make this, but if you want to think about how improvement might come about, then if we can reduce plate waste, and Angela's research showed how important that is in, say, the Italian example, then that will have a big impact later on. If we can move on to the next slide. This is, in a way, a sort of aspirational slide from us. This model is a fully up and functioning model, and in this slide, we can show you two really key pieces of data: what the total emissions per meal is, and also what the total emissions per kilogram food procured is. These are obviously key elements and key benchmark elements. What we would like to do is to be able to show how this compares with others in your sector. So not only can you see what you're doing, but you can see how others are doing as well. Obviously, to achieve this, we need to have lots and lots of people coming in and using this tool and build up that data knowledge. And that's one of the things we might discuss later, perhaps. If we move on to the next slide, this is the final slide in the results section. And this is taking the financial data and looking at how what the local economic impact of the service might be. And the indication from this particular set of data is that the total value to the local economy, that's the area within the 25-mile radius, is about 1.8 million. and that every pound spent generates a total of £2.44 in the local economy. The pie chart below it, which I won't go into detail on at the moment, shows where those various contributions come from. But again, the key point at the bottom, and the point that Angela made, is that this isn't just about local suppliers, this is about local staff preparing the food and how that's done, because this obviously has a very big impact on the local economy. And if I can move on to the next slide. The last thing we put into the tool, because we also wanted to think not only about where you were now, but what the impact of potential improvements could be, is to effectively do 4 different scenarios of things you might consider doing, and what the impact of that is, given the data you've given us in the first place. And you can switch those off or on the right-hand side. But broadly speaking, if you really want to have a public value benefit in terms of local economies, the most effective thing you can do is to spend more locally, both on staff and on food. And if you really want to have the maximum benefit and are not using a digester at the moment, is switch to a digester in terms of carbon. Those are obviously the 2 biggest things, but you can see that red meat and plate waste make significant, really significant additions to those areas as well. So we hope that then can give you an indication of how you might think about improving as well. If I move to the next slide. That really concludes what I wish to say. I want to make the point that this is a proof of concept tool. It has been developed synthesizing Angela's research with your data. It does have a great deal of potential, we think, for going further than that in terms of giving caterers a really good benchmark. And you're more than welcome to try the tool for yourself in its sort of demonstration mode, exactly what you've just seen here. And the link is there, and I'm sure those will be made available afterwards. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'll pass you back to David now.
That's great. Thank you very much, Adam. Now it's the turn of Simon Billing of the Eating Better Alliance. Simon?
Thanks, David. I don't have any slides, any beautiful slides, and thanks to Angela and Adam for those great presentations and great advantages. I think Stuart and I are going to talk to why we support this campaign. And I just want to say from a starting point, the Alliance, as David spoke to, the umbrella, brings together organisations across civil society from environment, climate change, animal welfare, health and social justice and farming. And I do think it's absolutely critical when we work on this agenda that we talk about all the co-benefits of less and better meat. Adam and Angela talked to many of those, from supporting the local economy to carbon reductions, but also talking critically about health and broader ecological health. I think we're at quite a turning point at the moment. I think the public sector, everybody is looking to the public sector as a beacon of really strong standards. Andy spoke to this start of this journey and into phase 2. Since this announcement, obviously the Climate Change Committee and many others will start to look at public sector procurement. I think the starting point is quite low at the moment. Just today or yesterday, Sustain launched a report on a survey of local authorities who had announced a climate and nature emergency. There are some 300 of those. Only about 12 have some sort of significant food policy that has something around procurement. So my sense is great start, but there's a lot of work to do. I guess I should also stay up front that there is some debate over the target. So we're supportive around the 20%, but I would see it as a start of a journey. We have a 50% target. I think some of our members would like to see more. So I would see it as definitely a positive start and on the journey. I wanted just to speak to some of the points that David raised about and Andy raised about the real drivers behind this campaign. I think there is responding change of customers and citizens on this agenda at the moment. We've just done a public attitude survey across over 2,000 people across the UK. And in the sort of 5 years existence of Eating Better, there is a significant change. 21% of people said they were eating less meat than last year. And there is signs of people moving towards a more, as Andy talked to, a more flexitarian diet, so not eating meat every day. And 65% are willing to eat less. So there's a real public willingness, a real public appetite for this agenda, but clearly it gets into the how are you going to help me do it? You know, give me some ideas. And for the first time, I think it's relevant for this discussion in Eating Better's history, health is the #1 driver. So I guess the COVID, Johnson, everything else is having an impact on the nation's appetite around this agenda. Animal welfare and environmental are big drivers for eating less, but health is definitely the strongest card. And not only that, pretty well overwhelming support, 3/4 or more, want to see bigger support for UK farmers that are delivering the highest animal welfare and environmental benefits. And when you start to talk about trade, it goes even higher than that support that doesn't undermine British farmers. So an absolutely strong, overwhelming support for less and better. The Climate Assembly recently said, which was again another public diagram, they talked about some meat, just less. So it's a very polarized agenda out there at the moment. People have very strong opinions. But I think the direction of travel is clear, and it's a hearts and minds debate. There's a lot of focus on carbon at the moment, and I'm sure Stuart will pick that up, and the debates around how carbon is measured across agriculture. I think the other thing that we need to be thinking about is the opportunity cost. There might not have been anything in the Johnson 10-point plan around eating less meat, although many people said he should have put something on his agenda yesterday, but he is talking about more trees. He is talking about carbon and locking up carbon in the land. So land is under big competition going forward for environmental reasons. 70% of our land is currently used under agriculture. A big proportion, 40% or more, is for grazing. So we don't see that as a conflict, but we're going to start to see, and Stuart will probably pick up on this, farmers, delivering strong environmental services and broader, carbon storage and locking, of which there needs to be incentives and financial support for farmers. You talk much about the importance of the UK farm economy. I think that's absolutely critical. Farming is the bedrock of that economy, and you as caterers turn that food into delicious and healthy plates. And I was really struck by Angela's data on, how strong in Italy around local sourcing, unprocessed, good food, and turning it around. I guess we all want to see the public sector as a beacon of high quality standards, but I guess I do worry, and I'm willing to be challenged on this as well, that it's possibly also the back door for low quality imports of food. So I want to be proved otherwise on that, but I get the sense that public sector is propping up a lot of poor quality meat from untransparent supply chains from elsewhere in the world, and we don't think a shift to chicken is a good idea. So I think there's a lot of people looking at you now, but I think that's going to be critical. So local sourcing will deliver that transparency. You talk a lot to health. I think health is the critical card. I think it delivers, this agenda will deliver on health, will deliver on sustainability. We need a repositioning of meat in the diet, not no meat. We need it something special, something that's treat. The caterers are in a great position to do that. I do think we need increasing attention around processed meat, where there is clearly issues around health and environmental issues, and some of the farming practices besides that. And it's the sort of obvious place where everyone agrees we should be eating a hell of a lot less of. So I throw that one out. We've identified a couple of ways as a group, and there's 60 odd of us, and we all don't agree. And a few of them are no doubt on the call now. But we've all sort of agreed that the way the caterers can play the role is, one, really putting more plants on the menu, more plant proteins, more options, with and without meat, blended products. We think it's about positioning on the menu. So with the language and the way it's presented is really critical. We do think, and David and Andy alluded to this now, it's moving now into targets, showing evidence of measuring and monitoring around meat, and we're going to be increasingly looking at seeing that evidence of that. I think building on what Adam said, we think it's really critical training chefs and bringing local, giving and equipping people to cook in different ways. And this is really exciting opportunities to engage staff and to engage chefs coming by. And then we think it's absolutely critical. We need to develop really strong sourcing better policies, which I'm sure Stuart will talk to, around really, as Andy spoke to, really sourcing best quality, highest standards, and using any savings that are made towards that. And the great thing is we have a group of organisations, from Friends of the Earth, World Resources Institute, Soil Association, Humane Society, that are all keen to work with you and work with others on making this happen. So yeah, really exciting start of the journey. And there's a lot of eyes on you to deliver this now.
Thank you very much, Simon. Now it's the turn of Stuart Roberts of the NFU. Stuart, how does less but better meat work for you?
Well, look, I'd quite like to start actually by going slightly back in time, David, and I think I owe the public sector caterers a bit of an apology actually, in that we, whether that be in the NFU or in the wider farming community, spend lots and lots of our time looking at supply chains. And I think one of the areas we've never spent enough time looking at is public sector catering. And I think I've been delighted over the last year, probably, I suppose, and it comes off the back of the 20% less campaign, that actually we have started to engage with you. I remember the first conversation I had with Andy. It was probably a slightly uncomfortable conversation for both of us, Andy, I suspect, in some ways. But actually what we found is we have so many common goals here. Conversations this morning about food waste, about fresh fruit and vegetables, about provenance, standards, production systems. And I think what it demonstrates is we are very willing partners to work with public sector caterers going forward. We want to, and I think we can help solve some of those challenges as well. And I think it's been really, really, really positive to date. We've actually now got a person who is employed to just look at this part of the business. And I think that's a massive endorsement. And with someone, and it's Bethan, who some of you will know, is phenomenally enthusiastic here. But what I wanted to do was just talk a little bit, and I will try and be brief, David, because I see the questions are coming in thick and fast. And if I take my normal 20 minutes, then actually we will have no time for questions. So I'll do my best, David. But I want to pick out a few things. And Andy, you started off by saying this is not about demonizing meat. And unfortunately, in this polarized world that we currently inhabit, too often as farmers, we feel that actually this becomes a very binary choice. It's about having no meat, or it's about, on the other side of the argument, eating too much meat. And the reality is that central pragmatic middle ground has been lost. And I'm delighted to be working with you guys and talking to you guys about some of this stuff. The other bit, and it hasn't yet been touched on, but I think is something that we recognize, is we can't ignore, if you like, the commercial aspect of some of this. The amount of budget that is set aside in some of these establishments that you guys are then being asked to fulfill the nutritional components for, with all the other bits that go with it, I think is a crying shame. I had not got a clue till recently about, what is the budget for some of these contracts. And I think we all need to look at what is the real cost of that food, because too often cheap food actually hides a whole load of costs that aren't visible to the consumer. And I think this campaign starts to do that. But what is it that that I believe are the key, if you like, factors that are leading the way that consumers think at the moment? Well, they've been touched on a little bit, but certainly provenance is becoming more important. Health is becoming more important. I think we've seen that more than ever before in recent times. And the environment has been touched on a bit today. And we fundamentally believe that beef and lamb has an important role to play in all three of those. We believe that beef and lamb in this country, red meat in this country, is amongst the most sustainable in the world, if not the most sustainable in the world. And that's why I particularly like this and better, because I think too often people basket up red meat as all red meat is the same. And Simon, you touched on this a moment ago. There is a fundamental difference between highly processed products and fresh products. And that doesn't just apply to meat. The same applies to meat alternatives. You know, I've certainly seen some meat alternatives that are pretty wholesome products. I've also seen some that are so full of salt, they really ought to carry a health warning with them. And I think that's where we need to start to look much more detailed in some of this. We need to think about not just what is the food. So it's not just about food, meat versus plant, but what was the production system? Where did it come from? Have we used ruminant animals for their main purpose, which is actually to turn cellulose into protein? You know, this is a miracle. None of us, and look, at times I may have looked like I developed a rumen. I cannot digest cellulose. But are we talking about ruminant animals that have been fed huge volumes of cereals or huge volumes of proteins from parts of the world that were once some of the most biodiverse parts? But I do also have some concerns around this area, particularly when I look at some carbon calculators that float around. So calculators that simply give one figure for red meat. So a kilo of red meat equals X kilos of CO2. Because actually what it doesn't recognize is different red meats are different. So if I take, for example, a kilo of British red meat, British beef, produced off our grasslands, it has a 48 kilos CO2 equivalent. Whereas if I take a global average, it's 99 kilos. And too often people use the global average. So I also feel you potentially are missing out here, that by switching to the better bit of it, and by switching to local and all those other things that we touched on this morning, you actually end up with an additional benefit, which you're not yet recognizing because we're not valuing the carbon reduction in terms of UK meat. But we also need to look, and Simon touched slightly on this, of the differences in some of how this is calculated. The fact that the transport figure that is used in some of these calculators, it may look pretty small, but the transport figure is calculated almost entirely on genuine CO2 emissions. CO2 emissions that sit in the atmosphere for 200 years and continue to accumulate. Whereas the CO2 equivalent emissions in terms of cattle is methane. Methane lives in the atmosphere for 12 years. It cycles, it always has done, and arguably is a different greenhouse gas to that that is associated with our addiction to fossil fuels. But I don't want to get all of these details and discussions muddying some of the water. The real issue here is about how do we all value standards? How do we all value provenance? And if anyone wants to have a recognition that the consumer and society is more interested in standards today and has a genuine interest in it, then just look at the petition that the NFU led earlier in the summer. 1 million people signing a petition to uphold our standards in this country. And it is vital. You know, ultimately, that is your consumers, your customers are interested in where their food came from, what its standards were. And Simon touched on land use. And I think this is a really interesting debate going on at the moment, because what we can't do is we'll put a load of trees in this country, Simon, and there's debate. The last general election, we all remember the Dutch auction that went on about who was going to plant the most trees. But then we'll simply offshore our red meat production and our meat production somewhere else in the world. We'll ease our consciences, but actually it will have twice as bad an impact, if not 3 times as bad an impact on the environment, on animal welfare and on elsewhere. So I think one of the things that I am extremely touched by at the moment is this fact that people are becoming more interested in food. But unfortunately, it is not being helped by the binary discussion that's going alongside it, which is basically trying to massively simplify the fact that all red meat is bad and that plants are good. And the reality is we know that is not the case. Now, the other thing I wanted to touch on is just 2 brief things, David, and then we will certainly have time for questions. One is, if you back British food, if you back British farmers, you are not only getting some of the most wholesome, nutritious, delicious foods in the world, you are backing one of the only farming industries around the world that has so far committed to do its bit for climate change. So we have an aspiration to get to net zero by 2040, 10 years ahead of the government's target. I know people will tell me it ought to be 2030, but we need to be realistic. And by buying British, then you are backing farmers who take our net zero commitment seriously. And that's something that I really value, and I know is something that is really important to you. And the last bit I wanted to touch on, and it was very interesting, it came out of I think it was Angela's piece of work at the very beginning, is we also need to look at fruit and veg. We do not grow enough fresh fruit and veg in this country. We need to grow more. We've got an opportunity to grow more. And we also need to consume more. It is one of the travesties in this country that we are not producing more and consuming more fresh fruit and veg, alongside some of the highest quality foods in the world, some of the most sustainable foods in the world. And I'd actually like to really pay tribute to you, Andy, because the very first discussion we had on this, you absolutely got this, that actually all meats are not the same. You really, really took up the challenge that I think I set down at the time, which was about understanding different production systems. And I am desperate for farmers, both locally, nationally, and elsewhere, to really engage with you guys, to help you guys in terms of understanding different foods, understanding different production systems, and ultimately putting on the menus of all public establishments the best possible food we can, the most nutritional food we can, and the most sustainable food we can. And we are ready to play our part in that.
Thank you very much, Stuart. In fact, thank you very much, everyone. I mean, a very, very broad range of ideas and views, and hopefully quite a lot of useful information for everyone there. We can't obviously hope to cover much of that in the time left to us for questions. So I'd like to sort of try and narrow the focus down a little bit on what we do cover. And one of the topics that several of you have mentioned is the sort of the meat substitutes that come in, the thought that they might be in some cases over-processed, and what that sort of over-processing might do both from a health point of view and from a sort of sustainability and CO2 emissions point of view. Andy, do you have any thoughts on that?
I do. I'm really concerned. I think we really do need to work with suppliers to ensure they're not over-processed. I really do think that will impact on the diet long term. And I really do want to work with suppliers, and I think all caterers will. I've really got a concern about it. And I'm sure Angela will as well, from a carbon side of it, because sometimes we think we're doing well and we could actually be causing a lot more issues down the track. So I have got a real serious issue on that. But I just want to add, I do support Stuart. I think that's another webinar about the 5 a day. We haven't got that right. We should be eating more fruit and veg. We should be growing more, and we should be buying British first where we can.
Sure, thank you. Stuart.
David, yeah, if I could come in on this, and I think in the same way as I get really frustrated that when it comes to meat, it's, you know, all meat is bad and all plants are good. It's exactly the same. So actually, look, there are some unsustainable meat production systems around the world. Okay, if I look elsewhere, I look at other parts of the planet. And when it comes to the plant side, there are very sustainable alternatives, but there are also some very unsustainable alternatives and some unhealthy ones. I look at, yeah, there was a new survey I was reading earlier that in 2019, they reckon there was 2 million deaths around the world associated with sodium content. So actually, we've got to look at, if you like, the meat alternatives with just as much scrutiny as we look at every other part of the diet. And there's good alternatives and there's bad alternatives. And unfortunately, it's never simple. And it's good that, Andy, you know, you're going to look to challenge suppliers, because I think it's an area that has not been challenged enough. And also, there are some huge commercial interests at play, just as there are in every other sector of the economy, and we shouldn't ignore that. And ultimately, we should be looking where possible at, you know, fresh, wholesome, whole foods, fresh fruit and veg, whole red meat, etc. And I think that is something that I really endorse.
Thank you. Angela, could you perhaps pick up on that point about the sort of the CO2 footprint of some of the meat substitutes that people are talking about?
Yes, so in our research, we did capture some of the meal services were serving some meat substitute products, actually in very small proportions, really. And when we were trying to identify appropriate carbon emissions coefficients to attach to them, we did struggle a bit, because I think that the agreement about how to calculate emissions accurately on these things is still in development. I think one thing that I did want to say, because I've seen that there have been some questions about this in terms of the emissions coefficients that we used for meat in our research, and we selected a list from Cranfield University, IPCC approved list, that did make the distinction between UK reared meat and EU and rest of world. So we were able to capture those differences, and we also did capture the difference in species, beef, lamb, and other meat species as well. So hopefully that then means that going forward with the carbon calculator, we are able to develop estimates that are more reflective of the UK situation. Although I'm well aware of the ongoing research in this area, which is looking at how different pasture management systems, different slurry management systems, livestock health systems can have an effect in reducing carbon emissions from ruminant livestock. I think the big problem, and perhaps a role for public sector catering as a very effective lobbying group, is to make the point that currently whatever research is coming through from Stephen Roberts' side of the house and everything about how emissions can be reduced from different livestock management systems, at the moment it's the figures that go forward for the national inventory are just based on a single estimate. And they don't take account of these things, and that is something that that's a link that needs to be made going forward.
Okay, thank you. I know Stuart wants to come in, but just before we turn to you, Stuart, Adam, perhaps I can bring you in briefly here. The tool, how flexible is it in terms of being able to look at how the red meat, for instance, is raised in the different sorts of farming systems we've heard about?
Yeah, currently, we said it's proof of concept, so we've had to limit the degree of difference there, but we already have in it and designed into it the kind of notion that you might well have different methods of meat production going into the system, and so then you could choose those at a sort of sub level, and then it would use more accurate carbon. So we have thought about it, but you can only do so much within the remit of what we've been able to do so far. But it's not a hard thing to do. No. But I would entirely endorse Angela's point. Our main concern is that anything we do is sort of creditable, auditable, and legitimate, and very much transparent. And so we need to be absolutely satisfied that that data was good data as well.
Sure, thank you. Stuart, yes.
Yeah, and I think, first of all, can I thank Angela for that? Because I think too often people do take very shortcuts to put a figure on red meat, which is this global average, which drives me nuts, because it doesn't relate in any way to UK systems. I think the other bit, and I touched briefly on it, is I think there is a very live debate going on, and I'd just like people to be aware of it, around how we treat different greenhouse gases. Now, for those who understand this is the difference between GWP and GWP star, which then puts a different, a very high value on methane, if you like, in the short term, but actually it recognizes that fact that CO2 has a much longer half-life to methane, and actually methane arguably and ruminants are part of a carbon cycle, whereas burning fossil fuels is a long-term accumulation. I think it's worth recognizing that, and I think something that may need to be reflected in those tools going forward. It's something we've been talking a lot about, and there's a lot of work coming out of Oxford at the moment on this area.
Thank you, Stuart. I am aware, everyone, that we are running slightly over, which we're quite happy to do just for a few minutes more at least. So please stay with us. Simon, perhaps I can just turn quickly to you now. We did have one other question, which I haven't had a chance to put to you yet. And that was someone who was talking about why the focus on ruminant meats, and might this not simply increase pork and chicken consumption rather than cut meat consumption overall? What are your thoughts on that?
I think, David, our position's quite clear on that. I don't think the focus should be on ruminant meat. It should be on less meat overall. And I think there's a real risk. And I think probably many people on this call see a substitution from sustainably managed beef and some of the, what Stuart's proponing into industrial produced pork or chicken. So I think we need a really clear, and I think the position you're taking around less and better is strong, but there are strong risks of unintended consequences. That's why I think it's really critical that you put the health and animal welfare, and we can't go further. There was another question around labelling, which I think is related. I would sort of be very cautious about carbon labelling. If you look at our own work, that's not something we prioritised either. We do need a public education. We do need to all understand the broader impacts of what we eat, and to others' point of process. But these are complex issues, as we're talking about. Don't put the burden on me, and spoil my meal and put something on my menu. Just create great dishes that are less and better.
Yeah, Stuart, did you have a point?
I wanted to completely reinforce what Simon said about labelling. I think some of it, and people have tried carbon labelling in the past. Consumers just don't understand it. How on earth can there, and I can't remember the exact figure, but how on earth can there be 4 kilos of carbon in a 30-gram packet of crisps or something? Yeah. And the other one that I think is important in this area, which we don't talk enough about, is water. So actually it's not just about carbon, it's also about the water footprint of foods. That feeds into its sustainability. And when I look at fruit and veg, and the atrocious amount of fruit and veg we produce in this country in comparison to elsewhere, we are importing way too much from parts of the planet that are water scarce. And it is a huge opportunity, I think, in this country, that horticulture sector, if we properly value how we can do things in this country as opposed to what happens elsewhere in the world.
Right, thank you. Very conscious now that we are running over and we're going to have to sort of try and wrap things up. I hope you won't mind if I just give a sort of final word to Andy here, just to sort of try and sum up what we feel we've gained today and what the sort of the next steps are for the campaign. Andy?
Thanks, David. I think it's been a really interesting session. It's been really good to have the different people on the panel, and I want to thank them all for what they brought to today. I think it's really what I said at the beginning. We've got to move now to the next phase. I think we need to look at our carbon and sustainability, but let's keep talking. Let's keep working together. That's got to be key. One thing I do think, and I've just heard about the chicken and the ruminant meat and pork, etc. I think we need to engage more in the AHDB, and we are talking to them as PSD 100. But I think they really need to look at our sector and start marketing themselves and marketing and selling into our sector. Not just saying, well, we can come with some recipes, but really get into us, because we are the future. As we come out of this pandemic, the public sector is the one that will be the constant. And yes, we are campaigning for more money. So Stuart, we're addressing that as well. There's letters gone off. But I think for me, we now move to the next phase. We need to evidence what we've done so far, and that's key for us driving this forward. But the only way we can do that is together, everybody working together. We're never going to all agree potentially, but I think if we can bring it together, give clear messages to our customers, give clear message to our teams, so when they're delivering it, they know what they're delivering successfully.
Right, well, I'm afraid that has to be it from us today. So my thanks to Angela, Adam, Simon, Stuart, and Andy, and you for joining us today. There will be a full link to the recording of this webinar on the Public Sector Catering website next week. We'll be back on December the 3rd with our next webinar, which will be looking at the issue of mental health in the workplace. A word of thanks to the suppliers who support the Public Sector Catering 100 group, and without whom events such as this webinar today would not be possible. You can see their names on the slide that follows. See you on December the 3rd. Goodbye.
Tuesday.